rivalries are the lifeblood of hockey.
The volume level in the building definitely goes up.
I love going into hostile territory.
Rivalry, pure and simple, is hatred.
They are Second City icons.
The Blackhawks are the world champions.
They are the black and orange of Broad Street.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Flyers win the Stanley Cup.
Where one cup drought must come to an end, and one goal changes the fortune of a franchise.
Patrick Kane has scored the goal.
One team, one guy is still going to be left standing, and you hate to be the guy that loses.
The 2010 Stanley Cup Final pitted Philadelphia against Chicago.
These are two teams that like to hit. We're going to see a physical series.
It had been decades since either team won hockey's coveted cup, and it didn't take long for the Flyers and Blackhawks to get to know each other on the ice, asking all the important questions.
Are you tough? Yeah, I'm pretty tough. You want to go then?
In the first postseason meeting between the two teams since 1971, fresh familiarity bred contempt.
That's your first good hit of the year.
Things are starting to get a little nastier between these two teams.
The series began in the Windy City, where since their inception in 1926, the Blackhawks had weathered ups and downs and established an identity that was uniquely Chicago. They are a pillar of the National Hockey League, born in 1926. The Chicago Blackhawks would win 2 coveted Stanley Cups in their first 12 years of existence. But then a generation of Chicago hockey fans would witness a dry spell for almost a quarter of a century. Their fortunes only to change in the late 1950s with the arrival of a young superstar, Stan Mikita, and the electrifying Bobby Hull.
Bobby'd come down the left side, and he would shoot high first. He'd waste one past your ear, and the second one you'd be ready for, and you'd think, I wonder if I'm going to get hurt on this one, and he'd go low.
The Golden Jet driving at center, in on the Ranger defense. He drives one,
Hull and the Hawks would end 23 seasons of futility when they faced their original 6 rivals, the Detroit Red Wings, in the 1961 Stanley Cup Final.
And there goes the Cyrus to end the game, and the Blackhawks are the world champions and the Stanley Cup winners for the 1960-61 season.
The 1961 championship would unfortunately represent the lone title in the Hull era. The Blackhawks would come up short in 4 other trips to the Cup Final between 1962 and 1973.
The game is over. Canadians have won the Stanley Cup. Listen to this crowd as they cheer their Blackhawks as they leave the ice.
Chicago and the other 5 original franchises were remnants of the NHL's old guard. When the next wave of NHL expansion took place before the 1967 season, the new franchise from Philadelphia would come to symbolize the NHL's new guard, and it began with one player.
The biggest move the franchise ever made was drafting a diabetic center in the second round in 1969, and went on to become one of the 10 best players in hockey history, at least at the time he retired.
Bobby Clarke and the Flyers quickly became the new face of hockey, and together they developed a new culture and style of play just fine for Broad Street.
A lot of people don't know why the Broad Street Bullies became the Broad Street Bullies, and it goes back to a playoff series they had against the St. Louis Blues where guys like Bob Plager were just beating up on the Flyers mercilessly. And Ed Snyder, who was the original owner of that team, said, never again. Never again will we be pushed around.
Don't land your 3 punches.
The Broad Street Bullies let their fists do the talking, and just 7 years into their existence, the Flyers were playing for the 1974 Stanley Cup.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Flyers are going to win the Stanley Cup.
One season later, the defending champs would do it again.
The Flyers have won their 2nd consecutive Stanley Cup.
Unfortunately, the Flyers' reign of terror and championship rings would be stopped by emerging dynasties in Montreal and on Long Island. The burden of the Bullies' back-to-back titles weighed heavily on the franchise.
In Philadelphia, they're still dining out on the Broad Street Bullies Cups of 74 and 75. But there was a sense that, well, at some point they have to make some new history.
1 decade after their last title, the arrival of a young, brash coach brought optimism to Philadelphia. But Mike Keenan's conference championship teams of 1985 and 1987 would lose to Wayne Gretzky and the Oilers twice in the finals. By the time Keenan was fired by the Flyers after the 1988 season, the old guard Blackhawks Cup drought had reached 27 seasons. Chicago was floundering in mediocrity. The man known as Iron Mike was hired by the Blackhawks.
When I first arrived in Chicago, it wasn't a very good team at all, but I enjoyed and thrived on the opportunity to win. And I think that was set by the expectation of the franchise.
The revitalized Hawks reached the conference finals in each of Keenan's first 2 seasons behind the bench. And by 1992, Chicago was back playing for the Cup for the first time in 19 years.
The Chicago Blackhawks celebrate the berth in the Stanley Cup final.
But the jubilation was once again short-lived. The Blackhawks were swept in 4 games by Mario Lemieux and the Penguins. The specter of 1961 continued to loom over the Chicago franchise. It would take a ping pong ball and a kid named Kane to alter the path of 2 franchises.
The first selection of the 2007 entry draft belongs to the Chicago Blackhawks.
And we proudly select
By the 2004 season, the Flyers were celebrating the 30th anniversary of their first Stanley Cup team. And they rewarded the Philly faithful with a trip to the Eastern Conference Finals, where they would be defeated by the eventual champions, Tampa Bay. But the Flyers had stockpiled talent, so much so, they were willing to part with a young fourth-liner who had trouble making a dent in the Philly lineup. His name was Patrick Sharp. The Flyers found a trading partner with Chicago in early December 2005.
When the Flyers traded Patrick Sharp, it was kind of a footnote. Ken Hitchcock was the coach. Ken Hitchcock was not a big fan of young, developing rookies. So he had no time for Patrick Sharp, figured he wasn't going to develop into anything. So the Flyers ended up trading him.
Sharp was joining a team where cup aspirations were a distant memory, where just making the playoffs would be cause for celebration. Chicago had been absent from the NHL's postseason 6 times in 7 seasons between 1998 and 2004. Although not immediate, Sharp's departure would impact both franchises.
Patrick Sharp in a 2-on-1.
As for his former team, the Flyers hit rock bottom in 2007, finishing with the worst record in their franchise's history. They were poised to have the first overall selection in the NHL's 2007 entry draft, but an unlucky bounce changed theirs and the Blackhawks' fortunes.
Everything turned around when that lottery ball fell. The Blackhawks went the luck of the bounce. You know, the ping pong ball goes another way and things change.
Patrick Kane was the best player in that draft, but it was not clear how good a player Kane would be. He was scoring wonderfully for the London Knights of the Ontario Hockey League, but he was small, he seemed one-dimensional, and while dynamic, there was no guarantee he was going to fully blossom into a star.
This is the first time in the history of the National Hockey League draft that the Chicago Blackhawks have had the first overall selection.
You know, I remember that whole year. I think I started as like a 3rd-round pick projected, and then I just kept going up and up. And then Chicago, I think they had the 5th worst team in the league that year, and they jumped up and stole the #1 pick.
And we proudly select from the London Knights of the Ontario Hockey League, Patrick Kane.
History will be rewritten, but the Blackhawks caught a break there, and they got Patrick Kane, a dynamic player, but also helped rejuvenate the franchise because of his personality, and the coupling with Jonathan Toews really energized the city of Chicago as far as hockey and that Blackhawks team. And if the Flyers get that pick, it's a whole different story.
Kane went first in the draft. The Flyers, with the 2nd pick, chose James Van Riemsdyk. The next time their paths would cross on the national stage, the Blackhawks and Flyers would be meeting in the 2010 Stanley Cup. Coming up, it would not take long for Patrick Kane to make a difference.
Patrick Kane, his first goal in the Stanley Cup Finals.
The 2009-2010 season presented an opportunity for both Chicago and Philadelphia to end their Stanley Cup droughts, as both teams would travel down an improbable road that would lead them to the Stanley Cup final.
I've never been in the Stanley Cup final before. We had a lot of talent. We had the ability to get there. We improved a lot of the things we needed to improve on.
The Blackhawks finished the regular season as Central Division champions with 112 points. After dispatching Nashville and Vancouver, the Blackhawks swept top-seeded San Jose in the Western Conference Final.
The Chicago Blackhawks are headed to the Stanley Cup Final.
Meanwhile, the Flyers would need Game 82 to qualify for the playoffs, facing the New York Rangers in a winner-take-all shootout, securing the final spot in the Eastern Conference playoffs.
The save by Boucher, and the Flyers are going to the playoffs!
After upsetting New Jersey in round one, the Flyers found themselves down 3-0 against Boston before storming back to take 4 straight to win the series in 7.
A comeback of epic proportions comes complete for the Philadelphia Flyers.
Riding high off their victory over the Bruins, the Flyers eliminated the Canadiens in 5 games.
The Philadelphia Flyers return to the Stanley Cup Final for the first time since '97.
It was a final nobody saw coming. It was a fascinating kind of, matchup.
I'd say they were the team that was most comparable to us, and you look at how they made it in the playoffs that year, beating all odds. So there's an intimidating factor that you're like, okay, well, as good as we play, it might not be good enough against these guys.
Game 1 from the United Center in Chicago. The Blackhawks and the Flyers, the 2010 Stanley Cup Final.
Every game in the playoffs seems to get bigger and bigger, and then you get to the Stanley Cup Finals, it's a whole different animal.
In Game 1, the Flyers and Blackhawks would put on a prolific and frenzied scoring display.
I think the teams were so skilled, they didn't quite know each other well enough, and that's why plays were working that generally would not work.
What a wild game.
It was a perfect storm. There are going to be lots of chances, and when you give really good players lots of chances, goals are going to go in.
With the score tied at 5, the Hawks would net the game winner midway through the 3rd. The Blackhawks emerged victorious in their first Stanley Cup final game in 18 years, which led to a more physical Game 2.
Everyone knew things were going to get a little more intense, a little more physical.
Enter Flyers agitator Daniel Carcillo to stir the pot.
Once he got back in lineup, you knew we were going to have some fun.
Coach, know you're playing tonight or not? Ask the coach if you're supposed to be out here.
With the addition of Carcillo, he made an impact right away with his speed and his physical play.
No one was safe from contact, not even Carcillo's own teammates.
Carter shaking up. What a hit. Good hit. That's your first good hit of the year. That's your first good hit of the year.
He was yelling and screaming, and that's great. Now that's hockey. That's playoffs.
Better have your head up in this game. Players from both teams, every opportunity they get to run somebody over, that's what they're doing.
Are you tough? Yeah, I'm pretty tough. You want to go then?
There's a little more hatred. There's a little more intensity, stuff after the whistle. Personal things that are going on between guys.
Already up 1-0, Chicago would take that all-important 2-goal lead.
Sausage scores! Beager! A former Flyer! Haunting his old mates! And just like that, it's 2-0 Hawks!
We were always coming back, fighting back, but at the end of the day, they got the best of us.
Chicago holds off the Flyers in the 3rd, and Game 2 goes to the Blackhawks.
Didn't really know a lot about that team. Going to Chicago, losing first 2 games, and obviously the results wasn't the result we wanted.
Down 2-0, the Flyers would need home cooking and overtime to keep their Stanley Cup title hopes alive.
Briere sets up Carl, side of the net, deflected, score!
After the overtime thriller, the Flyers would win Game 4 to even the series heading back to Chicago. And their newfound confidence was exuded by their team leader and renowned character, Chris Pronger.
What was the best of 7s, now best of 3.
Are you disappointed?
Deeply disappointed, yeah. Yeah, winning a hockey game, Johnny, it's...
No, I'm just saying, it's a little tight, dude. A little close to bucket.
That happens. It happens. They were pressing and coming hard, and, we got the win, though, John. That's all that matters. Don't be negative, John. Don't be negative.
In the midst of the heated battle, Pronger would be at the center of a game within the games.
And this one was pretty funny because Chris Pronger, who has his own way of doing things, would take the puck after a win by the Blackhawks and just take it back. It became almost a soap opera about it. You know, very middle school. You know, this was the NHL reduced to 7th grade.
It was funny. Prongs is a veteran guy. He just does a great job of, I guess, getting all the attention on him because he can handle it. Not many people can, you know, have that rapport with the media, you know, with the referees, with the other team, and he's just, he pulled it off.
Chris Pronger is a prankster, and so he'd like to get under the skin of not just his own teammates, but the guys on the other team. And it became a bigger deal than it was, and I know, knowing Chris, he giggled about it all.
All jokes would be put aside for a pivotal Game 5 in Chicago.
I remember going into it, the confidence, knowing we lost the game before, but I think we had a little bit of a chip on our shoulder to come out and you know, show our true colors.
Carried on by Ladd, and a shot knocked down left side of the net. Score!
That was the best 3 periods I think our team put together all season.
Gave it a Sharp in the slot. He shoots, he scores! Patrick Sharp!
I don't like that one song they play after they score. Da, 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 da. It's probably the most annoying. Can't get that song in my head because they played it 6-7 times a game there when we were playing them.
The Blackhawks took Game 5 with a dominating 7-4 performance.
The Chicago Blackhawks are 1 win from the Stanley Cup.
For Chris Pronger, Game 5 was a night to forget. Philly star defenseman was on the ice for 6 of the Blackhawks' goals, and in the penalty box for the 7th, Pronger finished the night with an atrocious -5.
Game 5, Chris Pronger was like the weather in Chicago in the dead of winter. It was -5. An awful game. Everything went wrong.
This was a bad night for Pronger, and when Pronger has a bad night, everybody in the Flyers looks around and, oh my, if he's doing that, we have problems. They got worse, and he was on the ice when everything happened.
Chicago Tribune decided to have a little fun and had a picture of him wearing a figure skater's costume. Not a man's figure skater's costume. I'm not sure he was wildly amused by that.
Coming up, the Blackhawks try to end a 49-year championship drought in hopes of bringing the cup back to Chicago. Game 6 would be back in Philadelphia. The Blackhawks were 1 win away from hoisting the cup for the first time in 49 years.
That means everything. I mean, every kid grows up dreaming of winning the Stanley Cup.
Game 6 is underway.
I feel like I've won it 1,000 times on my driveway back in Thunder Bay, Ontario, growing up as a kid.
When you become a hockey player and get drafted into the NHL, that's kind of the first thing you think about is bringing a cup to that city.
Shoots, deflected, they score!
And what it would be like to win one yourself.
The Blackhawks have a late second period 3-2 lead.
Late in the third, with their season on the brink, the Flyers would answer back.
Leno up with it there. Redwood in front, it bounced in on
It would take sudden death overtime to decide if there would be a Game 7 or a Chicago coronation.
And we knew we were going to get that overtime winner. At least we were telling ourselves that.
If the Blackhawks get the next goal, they are the 2010 Stanley Cup champions.
I think you always dream that maybe you'll be able to score a winning goal in Stanley Cup overtime.
On back to be taken by Campbell. Here's Campbell handing on to Kane again.
I just remember thinking, Kaner's going to pass me this puck and I'm going to score.
Lots of head fakes there trying to shake Tiemann. Threw one in front. Oh my, and rattled around.
Did he score?
It scored! We saw no light, we saw no signal, and we're not sure if they've sent a signal of a goal yet, but they are celebrating at the other end of the ice. What chaos!
Next thing I know, I'm chasing him around the ice like an idiot.
We have not seen a signal of goal from the referee yet.
The referee wasn't able to see it. The players on the ice didn't know, except for Kane.
I think the whole bench was just shocked. The whole city of Philadelphia, you know, even the announcers didn't even know what was going on.
They're all celebrating at the other end. I'm still looking at the puck at the net, and nobody can find the puck. And it took forever to find this puck.
If you listen to every call of that game, whether it's in the U.S. and Canada, in English or in French. Everyone lost sight of it because it was just one of these phantom things.
The way that Leighton went down, I saw the puck hit the back of the net from the opposite side because the back of the net popped up, which told me that puck went in the net. And when he went skating around, everybody was like, what's going on? I said, Hawks just won the Stanley Cup.
It is in! It's in the net! It's a goal! The Stanley Cup to the Chicago Blackhawks!
I don't think many people knew it was in the net. Everyone's coming down to celebrate with, myself and a couple other guys in Niemi and Sharp, and there's still guys looking back at the ref to look for the call and see if it was actually a goal.
It was finally maybe official when the cup came out, and I remember thinking to myself, okay, well, they can't call the goal back. It's officially in the net.
Jonathan Taves, come hoist the Stanley Cup.
To finally lift that Stanley Cup and be with the guys on the ice, it was a pretty amazing thing.
You'll never forget what that feels like to be in a position where you're playing for a championship and for a cup. And to be in overtime and not have that game go your way and your season be over as quick as a blink of an eye.
Not the most elegant of cup celebrations, but we didn't care. We were happy that we won.
The Blackhawks were champions. They would return home for a hero's welcoming, a city that rejoiced in Lord Stanley's return to the Windy City.
Chicago!
The Blackhawks would not need another 49 years to win another Stanley Cup. 3 springs after Patrick Kane's game-winning phantom goal, Chicago scored twice in the span of 17 seconds against the Bruins in another fabulous Game 6. In less than a decade, a slumbering Original Six franchise has roared to life. But that was almost 4 decades ago. Now the Flyers, confident in their own battle-hardened skins, keep searching for that elusive mix in the hopes of enjoying another triumph down Broad Street.